everybody, and welcome back to Southern Fried Crime, the true crime channel with a country twist. If you're new here, please remember to like, subscribe, and click on the little bell icon to be notified when new videos post. Thank you for listening, and now on with today's case. In today's case, we're going to be talking about the case of Tim Hennis. He was convicted of the murder of Katie Eastburn and two of her daughters. Later, the case was overturned on appeal, and Hennis was given a new trial. At the new trial, Tim Hennis was found not guilty, and he was allowed to go on with his life. Many years later, DNA came into being, and a DNA profile was obtained from the rape kit taken from Katie Eastburn. The DNA was compared to Tim Hennis, and it was found to be an exact match. But nothing could be done because of double jeopardy, or could it? See, what I didn't mention before was that Tim Hennis was in the Army, and he eventually retired. Could the Army possibly do anything to make sure Tim Hennis paid for his crime? The answer to this question would be yes, because of a little-known law called dual sovereignty doctrine. He was eventually recalled to the Army for the sole purpose of being tried for the murder of Katie Eastburn and her two daughters. Hennis was eventually found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of rape on the federal level, and he was sentenced to death. So sit back, get yourself a little something to eat and drink, while I tell you about the murders of the Eastburn family at the hands of Tim Hennis and how the U.S. Army helped put him away with the little-known and seldom-used law. Gary Eastburn was a captain in the U.S. Air Force. He met his wife Catherine, also known as Katie, in 1970, and they married in 1975. In 1983, Gary was sent to Pope Air Force Base in North Carolina. Gary was the chief of air traffic control there. In May 1985, Gary went for training in Montgomery, Alabama. Katie, as she liked to be called, was left at home to care for their 3 girls. Kara, age 5, Aaron, age 3, and Jana, age 1.5. When Gary Eastburn got back from his training in Alabama, the family was going to relocate to England. As a result, the family was going to need to rehome their English setter dog. There was an ad placed in their local newspaper. On May the 7th, 1985, Tim Hennis, a 27-year-old Army parachute rigger, responded to the ad placed by the Eastburns and took their dog home later that evening. Every night, Katie would receive a call from Gary. Like clockwork, these calls from Gary would come in, and like clockwork, Katie would also be there to pick up these calls. On the evening of May 11th, 1985, Katie didn't answer Gary's nightly call. Gary was very worried. The next morning, on May the 12th, Gary called a neighbor, Bob Seafeld, and asked him to go over to the house and check on Katie and the girls. Bob went over to the house and found a scene that came from a nightmare. Katie Eastburn and 2 of her 3 daughters, Kara and Aaron, were brutally murdered. Katie was stripped from the waist down, and an autopsy later found that she had been raped and stabbed multiple times. An autopsy found that Kara had been stabbed in the chest, while Aaron was bludgeoned in the chest and back. Jana, the baby, survived, but was dehydrated and had diarrhea. Detectives Robert Biddle and Jack Watts were put in charge of the investigation in the murders of the Eastburn family. Fingerprints and hair were found at the crime scene. Luminol tests showed that somebody had tried to clean it up. Missing from the house was an envelope of cash and Katie's ATM card along with the password. Patrick Cohn was a witness living near the scene. He said he saw a tall man dressed in jeans, a knit cap, and a black members-only jacket. He was seen carrying a black garbage bag. This all took place in the early morning hours of May the 10th, 1985. The man drove away in a white Chevrolet Chevette. Investigators believe the murders happened between 8 p.m. on May the 9th and 3 a.m. on May the 10th. Tim Hennis visited the police station on May the 15th, 1985, where he was interrogated by Detectives Watts and Biddle. Hennis said he picked up the Eastburn's dog on the evening of May the 7th. He then said he called and talked to Katie on the evening of May the 9th to talk about how Dixie the dog was settling into the Hennis household. He said he then drove his wife and daughter to his in-laws before coming home after filling his car up with gas. As Tim Hennis spoke to the detectives, they began to notice that he looked like the sketch made from the witness. Patrick Cohn also picked Tim Hennis out of a photo lineup. Later that evening, Hennis was arrested for the murder of Katie Eastburn and her 2 daughters. Katie Eastburn's stolen ATM card was used twice, once on May the 10th and the other time on May the 11th. The total taken was $300 from both days. It just so happened that Hennis was late on his rent by $300. A female witness saw Tim Hennis at the ATM on May the 11th. Nancy Miser, Tim Hennis' ex-girlfriend, said that he came over on the evening of May the 9th in order to try to get sex from her. This challenged his alibi that he had come straight home from dropping his wife and daughter at his in-laws' house. Hennis also took a black members-only jacket to the dry cleaners the day after the murders were thought to have occurred. By the time police found out about the jacket, it had already been dry cleaned, and so there was no biological evidence found. The icing on the cake was one of the neighbors of Tim Hennis said they saw him burning stuff in a burn barrel on the morning of May the 11th. The first trial of Tim Hennis took place in Cumberland County in summer 1986. Tim Hennis was defended by Gerald Beaver and Billy Richardson. The lead prosecutor was William Van Story. Hennis was offered a plea bargain prior to the beginning of his trial. In this plea bargain, he was offered 2 consecutive life sentences in exchange for his guilty plea. Hennis did not even think about it. He just pled not guilty to all counts. D.A. Van Story put forth the theory that Tim Hennis had taken advantage of his wife's absence from the home in order to start a relationship with the married Katie Eastburn. The theory was that Katie rebuffed him, and Hennis killed her and her 2 oldest children, who could have identified him, in order to keep Katie from reporting him to the Army, which would have resulted in him getting an other than honorable discharge. There were 2 main pieces of evidence against him. The most important was a lineup in which Patrick Cohn had picked him out of a lineup with Tim Hennis and 5 other men. The second piece of evidence was the female witness who saw Tim Hennis at the ATM at the same time Katie Eastburn's ATM card was used. The defense really didn't put up much of a case other than to try to poke holes in the prosecution's case, saying the 2 eyewitnesses were mistaken in their identification. Tim Hennis was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of rape. He was sentenced to death. Hennis was sent to death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. Not long after arriving on death row, Tim Hennis received a letter from a man calling himself Mr. X. The letter reads as follows: Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X. Tim Hennis' defense team made many appeals to get him off of death row. In 1988, a successful appeal for a new trial was made by attorney Gerald Beaver to the North Carolina Supreme Court. In his appeal, he stated that the jury was unjustly influenced by graphic crime scene videos and pictures. The judges ruled 5-2 in Hennis' favor to grant Tim Hennis a new trial. This marked the first time in North Carolina history that a death row inmate had a successful appeal for a new trial. Tim Hennis' new trial began in April 1989. Tim Hennis was represented by attorneys Beaver and Richardson, while the prosecution was being done by Cabin Collier and John Dixon. The defense challenged the prosecution's witnesses. They brought up the crimes committed by Patrick Cohn. Now, I tried to find out exactly what these crimes were, but I was unable to find out about the crimes of Patrick Cohn. And personally, I don't think that matters. From if he said he saw something, that shouldn't matter. I guess the defense thought that the crimes were significant enough to be brought up in court. The defense also questioned whether or not Patrick Cohn could have seen the man near the Eastburn home. The defense called a weatherman as a witness who said that on the night in question it was very cloudy and overcast, and nobody, even with perfect vision, could have seen the man near the Eastburn home. The defense also questioned the ATM witness for changing her story. When she was first questioned, she said she had not seen anybody at the ATM. It was only after multiple interviews by the police that she said she had seen a man resembling Hennis at the ATM. The defense also put forth two new witnesses. There was a newspaper delivery woman who said she saw a long-haired man driving a light-colored van near the Eastburn home near the time of the murders. There was also a young teen, John Rapal, who was out for his early morning run near the time that the murders were thought to have occurred. He was almost a mirror image for Tim Hennis and the drawing of the suspect. Attorneys Beaver and Richardson also presented footprint, blood, and hair samples that they said didn't belong to Hennis. The defense also presented Hennis's black members-only jacket, which they said had no blood evidence on it. After a 3-week trial, Tim Hennis was found not guilty on all charges, and he was a free man. After the trial, Gary Eastburn moved to England with his last surviving daughter, Jana. He took up a liaison role with the Royal Air Force. He met and married an English nurse in 1991. He retired from the Air Force and later settled down in Washington State. After the trial, Tim Hennis re-enlisted into the Army, where he was promoted to Staff Sergeant. In 1998, he moved with his wife, daughter, and son to Fort Lewis, Washington. He became a scoutmaster for his son Andrew. In 2004, he retired from the Army with the rank of Master Sergeant. Hennis then went to work in a waste treatment plant. That's where it stood for years. Gary and Jana Eastburn were left to wonder who killed their family members, and Tim Hennis was left to pick up the pieces of his life after being found not guilty. And so it was in May 2005 that Captain Larry Trotter went to a detective seminar in which the Eastburn murders were featured for a case study. Trotter learned that the DNA sample had been extracted from Katie Eastburn's vaginal swab, but who to match it to? The DNA from the rape kit was compared to the DNA of Tim Hennis, and it was found to be an exact match. Now, that was a DNA match, but Tim Hennis had already been found not guilty by a jury of his peers, and the rule of double jeopardy prohibits a defendant from being retried after acquittal. There was now clear evidence that Tim Hennis was indeed the killer of Katie Eastburn and her two daughters, but he was free and clear because he had already been to trial and was found not guilty. There was nothing that could be done. Or was there? There is a little known and seldom used law called the dual sovereignty doctrine. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the dual sovereignty doctrine is the doctrine holding that more than one sovereign, such as a state government being one sovereign and the federal government being the other sovereign, may prosecute an individual without violating the prohibition against double jeopardy if the individual's act breaks the law of each sovereign. The trial of Tim Hennis took place at a state level. He could not be tried again at the state level because that would violate double jeopardy. However, because Tim Hennis was in the Army at the time he committed the crimes of the murders of the Eastburn family, the crime also broke federal law. So, Tim Hennis could be retried at the federal level. In addition, the Uniform Code of Military Justice permits military personnel who had been tried in civilian courts to be retried in a military court. On September 26, 2006, Tim Hennis was recalled to military service. In August 2007, he was court-martialed on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of rape, in the rape of Katie Eastburn and the murder of her and her 2 daughters. Hennis appealed the decision to court-martial on the grounds that the Army lacked jurisdiction to retry him. This petition was denied in April 2008. In May 2008, Hennis appealed against the court-martial decision at the United States Army Court of Criminal Appeals, which was dismissed the following month. Hennis then appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, but this too was dismissed in September 2008. In December 2009, Hennis appealed against the court-martial at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, but this was rejected as well in March 2010. Hennis's court-martial at Fort Bragg began on March 17, 2010, and lasted for 3 weeks. For the court-martial, Hennis enlisted the services of military lawyers Frank Spinner and 2 uniformed lawyers. The prosecution was represented by Army Captains Matt Scott and Nathan Huff. Colonel Patrick Parrish presided over the court-martial proceedings, while a jury panel of 14 military officers and non-commissioned personnel were convened. The defense team argued that footprints, blood, and hair samples found at the crime scene did not match Hennis or the victims. They suggested that the crime scene evidence at the former Eastburn family home in Fayetteville had been contaminated. But what about the DNA evidence? Spinner suggested that Hennis had consensual sex with Katie Eastburn prior to her murder. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and found Hennis guilty on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of rape. He was sentenced to death, as well as he was stripped of all his military benefits and was busted down to a private. Tim Hennis continues to appeal his case to this day. That's all for today's case. Please tell me in the comments what you think about what happened to Tim Hennis. Was he treated fairly by the legal system, or do you think the Army had no right to bring charges against him? Please remember to like this video if you think it's likable, and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And click on the little bell icon to be notified when new videos post. Bye for now.